All right, let's go. Number 8. Enlil and Ninlil. Around 1900 BCE, Sumerian scribes in the city of Nippur pressed a story into wet clay that would not be read again for nearly 4,000 years. The tablet was buried beneath the ruins of a temple school. When scholars finally translated it in the early 20th century, what they found was not a love story. It was a crime report dressed up as mythology. The god Enlil was the most powerful deity in the Sumerian pantheon, the king of the gods, the one who controlled the winds and decided the fate of nations. He saw a young goddess named Ninlil bathing in a canal near the city. Her mother had warned her not to go there. She had told her daughter that Enlil's eyes were dangerous, that if he saw her, he would look at her in ways she was not ready for. Ninlil went anyway. She was young. She did not believe it would happen to her. It happened to her. Enlil forced himself on her. The text does not use gentle language. The original Sumerian is direct. The other gods heard about it. They gathered. They called him unclean. They named what he had done out loud, and they banished him from Nippur and sentenced him to the underworld. That should have been the end of it. A god punished for what he did. Justice served in heaven. But Ninlil was pregnant, and she followed him into exile. She followed the god who had assaulted her into the land of the dead because she was carrying his child and had nowhere else to go. And on the road down, Enlil disguised himself 3 separate times. Once as the gatekeeper of the city. Once as the man of the river of the underworld. Once as the ferryman at the final crossing. Each time, Ninlil did not recognize him through the disguise. Each time, he fathered another child on her through deception. 3 more pregnancies. 4 children total. All by the same god. All through force or fraud. The child from the original assault was Nana, the moon god, one of the most important and beloved deities in all of Sumerian religion. The god whose light guided travelers at night, whose cycles governed the calendar, who was worshipped in temples across Mesopotamia for thousands of years. That god was born from rape. The Sumerians knew it. They wrote it down without shame or apology. They did not hide it inside metaphor. They recorded it plainly and then built one of their most important religious traditions around the child who resulted. Enlil came back from the underworld. He was welcomed back. He resumed his place as king of the gods. The other deities who had called him unclean stood beside him again, as though the condemnation had been a temporary inconvenience rather than a judgment. He was never permanently removed from power. He was never tried a second time. The system absorbed the crime and kept moving. The truly disturbing part is not the crime itself. It is that the Sumerians built an entire theological system on top of it and saw no contradiction. The moon exists because a god did something terrible and was briefly inconvenienced for it. That is not a story about divine justice. That is a story about how power protects itself, and they carved it into clay 5,000 years ago because they had already figured out that truth. Before we move forward, do me a favor and hit that like and subscribe button. Now, let's get into this. Number 7. Enki and Ninhursag. In the paradise land of Dilmun, a place the Sumerians described as pure and clean and bright, the god Enki lived with the mother goddess Ninhursag. Dilmun had no sickness. No one grew old there. Nothing died. It was the closest thing in Sumerian mythology to a world without suffering. Enki ruined it in the most methodical way possible. He slept with Ninhursag and she bore a daughter, a goddess named Ninsar. Enki waited until Ninsar was grown. Then he slept with his own daughter. She bore another daughter, Ninkura. Enki waited again. Then he slept with Ninkura, his granddaughter. She bore another daughter, Uttu. Enki tried to sleep with Uttu too. She resisted at first. He came to her with gifts, with cucumbers and apples and grapes, and she let him in. He impregnated his own great-granddaughter, 4 generations, the same god each time. The texts describe the pattern with almost administrative clarity. He saw her. He desired her. He acted. No god intervened. No god raised a voice. The myth has been described by scholars as a fertility story, as a cycle of renewal, as a symbolic account of how the earth produces its plants. But the sequence of events underneath that framing is not symbolic. It is a record of a god who moved through his own family line for 4 generations and met no resistance. Ninhursag eventually cursed him. not for what he had done to her daughters and granddaughters. She cursed him for eating plants he was not supposed to eat. 8 plants. 8 curses. 8 diseases spread through his body until he was dying. The other gods panicked because without Enki the world could not function. They begged Ninhursag to heal him. She did. She created 8 minor deities to draw the sickness out of him one by one. She saved the god who had violated her family line because the alternative was cosmic collapse. What makes this story genuinely unsettling is what it says about the Sumerian understanding of the world. Creation requires consumption. Fertility requires violation. The divine order does not function through goodness. It functions through appetite. The gods who watch and say nothing are not failures of the story. They are the point of the story. The Sumerians looked at the world around them and they wrote down what they saw. Number 6. The killing of Kingu. Before humans existed, the gods had a problem. They had to work, they had to dig the great canals, carry the loads, maintain the irrigation networks that kept the cosmic order alive. The younger gods complained. They complained loudly and for a long time. The labor was endless. The work never stopped. They were gods and they were exhausted and they wanted a solution. So they held a council and decided to build a workforce. The raw material could not be clay alone. Clay without spirit would not hold. They needed something alive to mix into it, something divine, something with enough essence to carry the weight of labor across generations. They chose Kingu. He had commanded the army of the goddess Tiamat in the great war among the gods. Tiamat had risen against the younger generation of gods, and she had lost. Kingu had not started the war. He had not chosen to fight. He had been elevated by Tiamat and given command of her forces. When she was killed, he was captured. They brought him before the divine assembly. They asked him who had incited the rebellion. He said it was him. Whether he was telling the truth to protect Tiamat's memory or simply had no other answer does not matter. The decision was already made before he spoke. They cut his veins open. They drained his blood into a vessel. They mixed it with clay and shaped the first human beings. Humanity was not a gift. It was a labor solution. The blood running through human veins belonged to a god who was sacrificed so that other gods could rest. Our entire reason for existing was to carry loads that the divine class no longer wanted to carry themselves. The Sumerian creation story does not say humans were loved into being. It says we were manufactured for a purpose, and that purpose was service. What makes this genuinely dark is not the violence of the creation. It is the clarity of the logic. The Sumerians lived in a society built on coerced labor. Massive temple estates, royal fields, canal construction projects that consumed the lives of thousands of ordinary people. They looked at that system, and they did not pretend it was accidental. They traced it all the way back to the beginning of time, and they said this was always what humans were for. The gods did it first. Every king who came after was just continuing a tradition older than civilization itself. Number 5. Ereshkigal. The queen of the underworld was not a villain. She was a prisoner. The Sumerian texts say Ereshkigal was given to the underworld when she was young. Some versions say taken, some say assigned. The details vary, but the outcome does not. She was placed in the land of the dead before she was old enough to understand what it meant, and she could never leave. The rules of the underworld were absolute. Whatever entered could not return. That included its queen, not as punishment for something she had done, just as the condition of her role. Someone had to rule the dead. She was chosen. She had no say. Above her, her sister Inanna walked through the living world like it belonged to her. Inanna was the goddess of love and war. She was worshipped in every major city. Men wrote poems about her. Kings claimed her favor. She moved through the world collecting power and desire wherever she went. Ereshkigal sat below in the dust and the dark and received the dead, one by one, forever, with no company, no warmth, no day that was different from the one before it. When Inanna descended to the underworld, Ereshkigal had her stripped at each of the 7 gates. Every piece of clothing removed. Every symbol of power taken. By the time Inanna stood before her sister, she had nothing. And Ereshkigal killed her. She hung her corpse on a hook and left it there. Scholars have spent decades analyzing why. Some call it jealousy. Some call it the natural law of the underworld asserting itself. But the simplest reading is that Ereshkigal had been alone since the beginning of time, and the first person who came to see her was the sister who had everything she could never have, walking in as a visitor. As someone who got to leave. And something broke. The truly haunting part is that no one ever freed her. Gods negotiated, substitutes were arranged, compromises were made. But in every version of the myth, Ereshkigal stays in the underworld. Forever. Her imprisonment is treated like a law of physics. Immovable, necessary. The grief she carried was so extreme, the texts say it disturbed the boundary between life and death itself. And still, no one came back for her. Number 4. The cursing of Agade. Around 2200 BCE, the city of Agade was the capital of the most powerful empire in the world. The Akkadian Empire under Naram-Sin had stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the mountains of Iran. Agade was its beating heart. Rich, enormous, the center of everything. Archaeologists have been looking for it for over 100 years. They have not found a single stone. The Sumerian explanation survives in a text called The Curse of Agade. Naram-Sin attacked the Ekkur, the sacred temple of Enlil in the city of Nippur. He did not do it out of ignorance. He knew what the temple was. He knew whose house he was breaking into. He broke down the gates anyway. He walked through the holy chambers. He stripped the temple of its treasures and loaded them onto boats. He treated the house of the king of the gods like a conquered city. Enlil did not send a warning. He did not send a single punishment. He gathered 8 different peoples from the surrounding regions and sent them all into Sumer simultaneously. The Gutians came down from the mountains. Others came from the plains, the coasts, the river valleys. They did not come one at a time. They came together from every direction like a flood that had been held back and suddenly released. The fields stopped producing. The trade routes closed. Famine spread across the entire land. The text describes dogs in the streets, bodies no one buried, cities falling silent. The total collapse of everything that Sumer had built over thousands of years, all because one king touched the wrong building. And then Agade was cursed specifically. Never to be rebuilt, never to be inhabited, to be wiped from the earth so completely that future generations would not even know where it had stood. The curse held. Every other major city of that era has been found and excavated. Agade alone remains missing. The capital of an empire that controlled the ancient world for generations has left no physical trace. Whatever Enlil decreed in that text, the earth confirmed it. A city was erased so thoroughly that 5,000 years of archaeology has not recovered it. The Sumerians wrote a story about total divine destruction. History went ahead and made it literally true. Number 3. Namtar. Among all the beings in Sumerian mythology, Namtar is possibly the most tragic. He was not a monster because he chose to be one. He was a god built for a single purpose and given no other option. The texts describe him as carrying 60 diseases in his hands, one disease for each part of the human body. The head had its disease, the lungs had theirs, the stomach, the liver, the blood, the bones. Every organ had a specific assigned suffering, and Namtar held all of them. He served Ereshkigal in the underworld. When the time came for someone to die from disease, Namtar was dispatched. He reached into his hands and he delivered what was assigned to that person's body, and he returned to the dark. He had no other function, no other existence. He could not decide to spare someone. He could not refuse an order. He could not wake up one morning and choose to be something different. He was created as a delivery mechanism for pain, and that was the entirety of what he was. A god whose whole being was suffering inflicted on others without choice, without rest, for as long as the universe continued to exist. The Sumerians were not trying to explain evil when they created Namtar. They were trying to explain disease. The way it arrives without warning, the way it strikes people who have done nothing wrong, the way no prayer or sacrifice seems to reliably stop it. Their answer was that disease was not a mistake or a punishment. It was a system. Someone was assigned to run it, that someone had no more control over it than a human farmer has over the flood. He was just doing what he was made for. That answer is more disturbing than any monster. A monster chooses its cruelty. Namtar had no choice. And the 60 diseases he carried in his hands killed people who never knew his name, in cities that worshipped other gods entirely because the mechanism was built before any of them were born, and no one had ever shut it off. Number 2. The death of Dumuzi. When Inanna came back from the underworld, she had made a deal to get out. A substitute had to go down in her place. The demons of the underworld traveled with her back to the surface, watching to see who she would choose. She walked through the cities. She saw her servants weeping for her. She saw her beautician covered in dirt, mourning. She saw everyone who loved her in grief. Then she found her husband. Dumuzi was sitting on her throne. He was wearing fine clothes. He was not mourning. He had not torn his garments or covered himself in ash. He had not wept or fasted. He had simply continued with his life as though she was gone, and the absence did not bother him particularly. He was comfortable. That was the word the text keeps returning to. He was comfortable in her throne, in her house, with her gone. Inanna looked at him. She pointed at him. She gave him to the demons. He ran. He begged Utu, the sun god, to transform him so he could escape. He was turned into a snake, then a gazelle, moving through the landscape trying to put distance between himself and the things chasing him. But the demons always found him. They always brought him back. He was dragged into the land of the dead screaming, and Inanna did not intervene. She had made her choice. She watched him go. His sister Geshtinana found out what was happening. She had no obligation to help. She was not part of the deal. No god demanded anything from her. She volunteered to take half his punishment, to spend half the year in the underworld herself so that her brother could return to the living world for the other half. Because of her, Dumuzi does not stay dead. He descends every year and comes back every year. The crops die when he goes down. They return when he does. The Sumerians used this to explain the seasons. They encoded the story of a man condemned by his wife's fury and saved by his sister's love into the cycle of planting and harvest, into the thing every farmer watched happen every year without understanding why. They looked at the world going dark in winter, and they said a god is down there right now, suffering for a sin that was nothing more than insufficient grief. And they did not present that as unjust. They presented it as the way things are. Love punishes those who take it lightly. The universe runs on that punishment. Every harvest that has ever grown was watered by it. Number 1. Nergal and Ereshkigal. A god of plague and war looked down into the underworld and saw a queen who had been alone since before memory began. He decided to go down and take what she had. Nergal had insulted Ereshkigal by refusing to stand when her messenger came before the gods. It was a small offense, but the underworld does not forgive small offenses. He was sent below to apologize in person. He arrived. He did not apologize the way one apologizes when one is genuinely sorry. He came in the posture of a man who knew he had leverage. He was alive in a place built for the dead. He was powerful in a place that had no defenses against the living. And Ereshkigal had been alone for an eternity. He stayed 6 days. He was attentive. He was present in a way no one had ever been present with her before. She had never had a companion. She had never had anyone who came specifically to see her. On the 7th day, he left without saying goodbye. He simply walked out through the gates and returned to the world above as though it had been nothing. Ereshkigal fell apart. The texts describe what happened to her after he left in detail that is hard to read. She screamed. She pressed her thighs together and rocked herself. She cried out that she was dying. She sent a messenger to the gods in a rage, threatening to raise the dead and loose them on the living unless Nergal was returned to her. She was not asking. She was threatening. The grief of a woman who had been alone since the beginning of time and had briefly been given someone to hold and then had that taken away was enough to destabilize the boundary between death and life itself. The gods sent Nergal back, but he did not return as a lover returning to someone he had hurt. He came back as a conqueror. He smashed through the gates of the underworld one by one, tearing each down as he went. He found Ereshkigal on her throne. He grabbed her by the hair. He pulled her down from the throne and dragged her across the floor. He put a blade to her throat and told her he would cut her head off. She did not scream again. She looked at him with a blade at her neck and she offered him the throne. She offered to share the rule of the dead with him. She offered him everything she had in exchange for her life. And he accepted. He let go of her hair. He took the throne beside her. He became king of the underworld. That is how the ruler of death was installed, not through divine appointment, not through a vote of the gods, through a man grabbing a woman by the hair after she had already been broken by his abandonment and holding a weapon to her throat until she gave him what he wanted. What makes this the darkest story in the Sumerian record is not the violence. It is what it says about Ereshkigal. She had been placed in the underworld as a child. She had been abandoned there by every god who had the power to free her and chose not to. She had lived in complete isolation for longer than any mind should be able to hold. And the only companionship she ever received came first through manipulation, then through desertion, then through a blade at her throat. She accepted it. She said yes to the man who had just threatened to kill her because even that was better than going back to the silence. 5,000 years ago, someone pressed that story into a clay tablet. They did not write it as a horror story. They wrote it as a fact about the world, about loneliness, about what people will accept when they have been left alone long enough, about the kind of power that finds the most broken person in the room and uses that brokenness to take what it wants. The gods themselves were not above it. Nothing was.